At concerts, everybody goes to a show and is like, I can't hear the vocals, or like, why is that bass guitar so loud, or stuff like that. We pick out volume first, and then not until all of that is sorted out do we start worrying about tone.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm good too, thank you. We've been talking before we started this episode, and I told you about myself, but I didn't hear about you, so go ahead. What's new?
Okay. Well, I thought for this episode, I would talk about the need for a good sun hat still. I don't know, if you're not in our Facebook community, you would have missed this. So that is yet another reason to go check out our Facebook community, and probably the worst reason. But our podcast editor, Thomas, photoshopped an edit, like a picture of me wearing this ridiculous location sound mixing hat I mentioned on another episode, which is like a hat with holes cut in it so that you can have a sun hat but also wear headphones. Pretty ridiculous looking, and he did a really good job getting the edit in. I've got to say, it looks like I'm wearing the hat.
Yep.
Yeah, pretty funny. But anyways, I didn't get that hat, and I went and did another gig yesterday, and I am yet again very sunburned. So this is all my fault.
Sunscreen is a thing, dude.
I know. I thought I was working inside, and and there's just no way around it. This is all my fault. I'm gonna have a heck of a tan by the end of the year, though.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you'll have. Yeah, so that means you were on film locations again.
Yes. Not like a super allowed to talk about what we were working on. There's always these little NDA things, but I can say that we gave away over 3,000 bags of chips. So it's a pretty fun gig.
What? Like when you say chips in Canada, do you mean chips or do you mean fries?
We mean potato chips.
Potato chips.
Yes, not fries.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. By the way, Europe, your chip game is really weak. You guys don't have chips figured out. It's like a way of life over here. There's so many different flavors and different brands, and I found kettle chips in Denmark, I think, when I was on tour there. And that was the only place in Europe I found them, and they were like, 10 bags for a bag or $10 for a bag or something crazy expensive.
Yeah, you're totally right. I think we have them. But it's not what we're best at.
All right. If you ever come over to Canada, I'm going to treat you to the cuisine of very high quality chips.
Yep, we're going to do that. That sounds like a plan. Awesome.
Right on.
Yeah, by the way, if I sound a little weird today or different, or if there's a lot of background noise or whatever, I'm not sure yet if that will be the case. I'm using a new microphone, because the wonderful people from Antelope Audio sent me an Axino Synergy Core, I think it's called. It's a USB mic. I think I posted it in the community once because I just saw it and thought it was a cool concept. It's like a USB mic, and it has mic modeling built into it, so you can switch between different mic models, emulations. It has like preamps. There's a BAE Neve like thing simulation in there. There's API EQs and compressors and all these things built into the software, and you can use all of those emulations. And it's an interface at the same time. It's like one USB cable, and it's like the interface and the mic in one thing. And I just wanted to try it, and they sent it over to me to try it. And now I'm testing it and see if I'm going to keep it or not, or I don't know. We haven't talked about that yet. For now, I just have it, and I'm curious to hear if you think that's better or worse compared to our other episodes. So that's why I'm sounding a little weird. Maybe.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, so far, I think it sounds good, man, from what I can hear just over the feed. So, yeah, I'm excited to hear that as well.
Cool. Yeah, me too. I'm just concerned about the room and the fan noise of my computer, because those are the two reasons I kept using the SM7, as we've been talking about a lot, and we always recommend to you guys when you record at home, vocals especially, that you use or try a dynamic microphone for that very reason, because if your laptop is close to the mic, it will be pretty loud. The fans of it will be pretty loud. Mine is loud as hell. And then the room as well is going to be a problem in many rooms. And with a condenser, these are real issues. And with a dynamic, you can sort of get around it a little bit. So I'm curious. Maybe my room is good enough. Maybe not. We'll see.
We'll find out.
Yeah. All right. Other than that, we are talking about a basic audio concept today. That is probably one of the most important concepts, or skills to have, but also one that I think many people don't think about too much or don't practice a lot because it seems so obvious and so simple and easy to do. And that is being able to create a proper balance, like just balancing out your tracks, setting the right volumes and pan positions without like touching plugins, without EQ, without compression, just fader volumes, clip volumes, panning, just the levels of things, like balancing that out properly. I think that is the most important thing in any mix. And it doesn't matter how good your drums sound or your vocals sound. If you mess up the balance, the mix will not work and it will not like translate well, and the emotion will not like come across. So I think that this is a really good mixing skill, but it also is good. It's a good thing to know and how to do when you're recording, because you want to do a rough mix. You want to hear things in relation. You want to hear things in context. You want to be able to know, to judge if a guitar tone actually fits the song. And you can only do that if you hear it in context and you have proper levels going. And so, yeah, I think balancing is really, really important. And I don't think that you practice it enough, maybe, if you're listening right now, because I for sure didn't for a long time, because like dialing in EQs and compressors and all that is much more exciting than just moving faders. And we all think we can already do that, but we probably can't.
Yeah. It's a lot less sexy than grabbing your favorite plugin or hardware or whatever you're trying to use and just like to change how the audio sounds on its own, right? That's also something we've talked about a lot on this podcast, is not working in solo, where we're working in context. So it's really easy just to solo the instrument you're focused on and start sculpting it, right? But it doesn't really matter how it sounds on its own. It matters how it sounds in relation to everything else. And the main thing that dictates how that sounds with everything else is the volume of it. Just straight up the volume of it. Second would be panning, I think. So really, when we say, like, we're talking about the basics of balancing a mix, we're talking about volume and pan. And just those two tools can get you so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about it, if you've ever played a song to a friend of yours or your spouse or family, I don't know, and you asked for feedback, the one thing they probably say, or the first thing they probably say is, if they say anything, they say the vocal is too loud or too quiet, or I can't hear the guitar, or this is too loud, or whatever. Like the first thing they're gonna notice are the levels. They're probably not talking about I don't know, transients or the EQ curve or whatever. Like, unless you really messed it up, like they won't notice those things. But what they will notice is if something is too quiet or too loud. That's the first thing. And so that is obviously the most important thing, and you don't want to mess that up. So that, I think that makes it really clear how important that really is. Mm-hmm. And even we, I think, Malcolm, with like experienced ears, when we listen to music and something is just not right, like the level of it, it's just too quiet or too loud, it's like not pleasing to listen to, not awesome to listen to. Yeah,
totally. It is just naturally the first thing that we'll pick out. You're right. And it's the same at live concerts. Everybody goes to a show and is like, I can't hear the vocals, or like, why is that bass guitar so loud, or, you know, stuff like that. We pick out volume first, and then not until all of that is sorted out do we start worrying about tone.
Yes. Now, why do you think is it difficult, or why can that even happen, that you end up with a wrong balance? Because you would think you listen to your song and you set the levels, and because you listen to music yourself, you should know how loud things are supposed to be, and then it should be fine. So why is it the case that so many mixes are actually not well balanced? Like, how can you end up with a wrong balance?
I mean, it's so easy to wind up with a wrong balance. I think it's a lot easier than it is to get a good one. Like, it's a skill I'm always working on. It's always different, for one. There isn't. I've seen people like make cheat sheets, like your bass guitar should be this many dB quieter than your kick drum or something. It's like that is just bullshit. Sorry,
Yep.
there's no that doesn't work. It's always dependent on everything, the whole arrangement, the tones do play a role into how things we perceive the volume as well. Just the speed of the song, the parts, the emotion behind it, everything's different. So it's always different. So you have to get really good at reacting. And it's funny, I was thinking about this the other day, and so much of what we do is actually using our ears. And we say that all the time, but what we really do is learn a new technique and then try and use it. But we're meant to just listen and respond. No step that we make in engineering or mixing or mastering should ever be done without us hearing something and wanting to change it. But I think often we do things just because.
True.
Just because we've heard of it being cool, or it's something we did that worked on a previous mix or a previous song. But there should be no decision that's not made based on what our ears hear. And this is no exception. We have to get really good at hearing two channels together, or two or more channels together, and figuring out what volume they need to live together at. And another reason, getting back to your question, Benny, for why it could be wrong, and it's that as you add things to your production, so bring this to the context of recording your band, as you add things, overdubbing, all of the work you put in before could potentially change based on the new thing that you have introduced to your song. So you have to constantly rebalance as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to. And I think while you were saying that, I just wrote down a couple of things so I don't forget it, because I can think of a couple of reasons, or I assume these are the reasons, and I know for a fact that these were reasons for me at least, that lead to people like making wrong balancing decisions. So yeah, I agree that it will probably change throughout the project, and you have to rebalance stuff, and it starts with like balancing things out while you record. But I think that the main reasons for a wrong balance or a weird balance are monitoring too loud is a big one, I think.
Definitely.
I have a very hard time. I want to monitor loud often because I just want to feel how the song feels, and like I have a volume. I have like a couple of spots on my monitor controller that I like switch back and forth between. Like I have my standard listening volume, and I have a very quiet volume, and I have a super loud volume just so I can feel the low end and all that. So that is fun to listen to the mixes like that. But I feel that if I listen too loud, I can't. Like balancing is the hardest part when you're listening so loud. I think that you can't really hear the top end in relation to everything else. So you can't really hear like everything. It's just whenever I turn it down really quietly, I immediately notice if things jump out. And that doesn't happen when I listen loud. I don't know. It's the compression that your ears automatically do. And it's like, I don't know. But I think that's a big one, like monitoring too loud. I don't know if you agree with that or.
Oh, entirely. And it is tricky because I actually think that tracking loud, there's some real good reasons to do it. Like you said, feeling the low end, just getting the musicians in the room on like an emotional level with the song. That is easier at a high volume. It's fun, keeping the mood up. But to get the balance right, you have to turn it down. I'll go so quiet that the musicians in the room are like, "What are you doing? Just give me a second. It's gonna be better."
Yeah, absolutely. Especially the top end. If you've ever tried to balance hi-hats or cymbals, for example, with the rest of the mix, and you do that while you're listening super loud, it's not going to work. Like the top end will likely be way too loud, or like probably too loud, because I find I can't hear the top end properly if I'm listening very loud. Like the mid range and the low end and all that gets super loud, but the top end kind of disappears, or my ears tend to ignore it. And if I turn it down, I notice that I have super loud cymbals, for example. So that's one thing. Then and the second one, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the first point here, is fatigue. If you're listening for too long, if you don't take breaks, or if you just know the song too well, if you've worked on it for too long and you're not objective anymore, then that leads to bad balancing decisions, because you're just so used to how things sound that you can still hear something that is actually too quiet, and you don't turn it up enough because you just know what it should sound like or what it sounds like, and even if it's very, very quiet, but that's not how a new person hears the song, and you probably don't notice that anymore. Or maybe something has been like you don't like the sound of something, or you've been battling an issue for a while, and then you turn it down too much because it's annoying you, but it actually
Yeah.
has to be loud or whatever, like things like that. And I think the more you work, the longer you work on a song, and the more ear fatigue you have, the harder it also gets to balance it out. And that's when
Mm.
you absolutely need feedback from someone else or just a longer break.
Yeah. Yeah. There's very good argument to balancing as early as you can, especially in the mix. It should be step number one, I think. Um, and then taking breaks, getting context. Like all of these things are things we have to do just to have our ears unbiased enough to do a good job at balancing.
Yeah, totally. And then the next one here is, and that gets interesting now, and we need to talk about that in depth, I think. And that is the one reason for a bad balance is that people don't make a rough mix. They don't really make a rough mix before they start to mix. What I mean by that is, and I did that for a long time as well, and I'm just starting to remind myself of that again, and like do it properly in a way. And that is like I would open a session and start a mix, and I would immediately go to like the kick drum or the snare drum or whatever. I would just have a quick listen, and then I would immediately jump into the individual elements and like tweak the kick drum, tweak the snare, tweak the vocals, whatever. And before I actually listened to the whole song and created a good balance, I'm like knees deep into like all those,
Yeah. The
things.
detail work.
And I don't think that's good. I think the better way to do it is to make a really quick, intuitive rough mix first. Like you said, like react to the song, just hit play and set quick levels. Just make sure you can hear everything clearly, and just make sure you get familiar you make yourself familiar with the song, and only do it by, I'd say, and that's something we need to discuss. I'd say leave the faders at 0. So you have full fader resolution, and that way you can also always go back to your rough mix easily in case you screw up. So I tend to leave the faders at 0 and only grab the clip gain, or if you have a gain knob or a gain plugin or something like that, you can use that. But I do it just with the clip gain in Cubase. And then I just go through the song and turn things up and down really quickly, just reacting to the song and find quick levels. And when I'm done with that, like 1 or 2 passes, I want to have a rough mix so that I can that's just working. So when I hit play, I can hear the song. I can hear everything. It's not sounding perfect, but I can hear the vocals, I can hear the kick drum, I can hear the snare drum. And while I'm doing that, I've already identified a lot of the problems that I might need to address. And if I don't do that and immediately start with the kick drum or the snare or the vocals or whatever, I might address problems that are not really problems in context.
Yep.
And I might take things out that don't really matter in the whole thing. And so by making a proper rough mix first and intuitively and very quickly, you'll have your initial reaction, your gut feeling, baked into that rough mix. And if you keep the faders at 0 and you save your sessions as a rough mix, you can always go back to that later. You can just put the faders back to 0, or like open up the rough mix if you saved it as a separate thing and start over if you need to, or just compare your rough initial balance with your mix later in the process. Just in case you lost perspective. So I think making a rough mix and saving it is a great way to make sure you still have a good balance in the end, because that first reaction is probably more accurate than what you will do after working on it for 8 hours.
Absolutely. Yeah. To give some examples of focusing on something that might not matter, I think anybody that's gotten into recording drums has probably gone through a phase where they're way too concerned about bleed. They're like, there's like a little hi-hat in this snare, and they're just like freaking out, trying to figure out how to notch that out or gate it out or whatever. And sometimes that's exactly what you should do. But once you do a rough balance and there's, a huge hi-hat groove in the song, it's like, I should have just left that. Like it sounded fine, like it doesn't have to go just because it's there. Another one might be like S's on vocals. we always record vocals last, unfortunately. I mean, and we've advocated for not doing that, but it often happens. And your ears are exhausted, and all of a sudden, like S noises are just like the worst noise on the planet to you. You just hate them, and you're freaking out about getting rid of S's. And then you come back the next day, and your singer has a lisp, and it's like, whoops. So context is everything yet again.
Yeah, so I agreed absolutely, and I really think that this is such a good way of doing it. And I'm curious if you do the same, or if you've ever done the same, like the whole faders at zero thing. Because now that I've explained it, this was like when I started a mix. This is about mixing, and I know that many of you, if you're listening right now and you're mixing, I know chances are you're mixing. We know because we've asked our audience, and we will actually do a little more mixing content in the future as well, because a lot of you are mixing, and maybe you just do a rough mix or demos, but still, you probably play around with that. And so this was relevant for you if you're mixing, but it's also relevant for you if you're just recording, because I think building that rough mix, that rough balance, and you said it as well, Malcolm, is crucial from the beginning. I think you should do that. You might have to rebalance. You might have to adjust things. You want to have the thing you're recording right now. You want that to be the loudest thing, probably. But still, you should, in between like sessions or whatever, you should still make rough mixes and create a quick balance and see if everything's working together the way you intended.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way around it, I think. And in both scenarios, I'll do the faders at zero thing. I didn't do that for a long time, but I really enjoy it now. Like, when you record and you leave the faders in the DAW at zero, and you just turn up the mic preamp loud enough so that what you're recording is at the right volume in context to everything else, you'll already have a rough mix when the recording's done. Like, you don't even have to create one. The rough mix is already there from the beginning. And in most home studio scenarios, you don't have preamps that do anything special if you crank them. So there's no reason to record hot, and we've talked about that on the podcast already. And even if you do have gear that requires you to crank it, maybe there's an output knob or something like that, or another way to just turn it down. But I find recording quiet, if the source is supposed to be quiet, is a great way of doing it. And that way you just build one thing on top of the other. You always have your rough balance, your rough mix. And you don't have to do as much later to come up with that rough mix. And I don't know if you do the same, but I really enjoy this whole faders at zero thing a lot. And I try to keep it that way throughout the whole process. And whenever I change something, whenever I process something, I try to compensate for that gain change, that volume change, so that the fader can stay around zero, and whatever EQ or compression I'm using is not giving me a completely different level, if at all possible.
Right.
So do you do something similar?
I don't do the faders at zero thing, and it is just because of me driving preamps that can't really be turned down properly. So it's just a workflow thing for me, and also just like hitting some hardware at certain levels and stuff like that. So it's not. I mean, it's totally possible. I could find a way around it, but it's just not how I work. But I love the idea of it so much. It's great. And then imagine doing that, like Benny's system, and then you send your tracks to get mixed by somebody. You're essentially giving them your mix already because it's already balanced. It's such a good idea. And a mixer would be very impressed receiving those files, just pulling them into their session and be like, whoa, it sounds awesome. So it's a good way to I guess impress as well, which is cool. But I do 100% stand by the rough mix being like an essential skill to being a tracking engineer. Not even if you don't plan on being a mixing engineer at all, it is hugely important to the process. I listened to a conversation with Tom Lord-Alge talking about getting a gig from his brother Chris Lord-Alge, and they're like two of the most famous mixers on the planet. If you don't know who they are, but I guess Chris told Tom, just whenever you click play in front of clients, it should sound like a mix, like in tracking as well. And I was like, that is it, because they need to be impressed every single time. And so that essentially means you have to be doing this all the time as you're recording, and keep everybody on track with the vision. If you don't do this, people in the room will start to think the song sucks because it sounds like it sucks, right? So it's constant. We've talked about the 80-20 rule way back on this podcast. This is almost like a 10-90 rule, where it's like it's 10% of the work, but it equals 90% of the mix.
Yes, so much.
It's so important, and it takes very little time. You honestly, actually, if you want to practice this, just do like little 10-minute bouts of just like reset everything, make a save where it's just all blank, and then set a timer for 10 minutes and go. And just, or like, real time, start to finish of the song even. So like 3.5 minutes on average, it's a great way to get good at it, and something you should totally do. Yeah, I do, I guess I do the same thing as you, just not with that method. But I do a mix where everything just gets balanced kind of at the start of every day, at every instrument, and especially at the start of a mix. That's my number one step. The only exception I would say that I think we should mention is in the tracking situation. If, say, you're doing vocals, the vocals are probably going to be a little bit louder than they will be while you track the vocals. That I guess could just be preference, but I think for me anyways, I like to hear it a little louder than I know I will want it, just so I can really take out the details really easily. And I still want it to sound in context with the music, but it just ends up being that little bit louder, and then once we're done, it ducks back down to where it should be.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, you want to do that. You want to hear the details when you track. The same as with guitars, as you were telling me before we started. You want to hear the noise in between the chords, or when a chord rings out, you want to hear what happens. Yeah, totally. You want to crank the guitars a little bit to hear what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But you still have to rebalance in between takes or sessions, I think, and constantly check it against everything else at a proper volume. So yeah, there's both. I'd say I want to tell you about a podcast episode that you should listen to, and that is, and I told you, Malcolm, I think, but I want to tell the audience, and that is an interview with Vance Powell. He did it on the Recording Studio Rockstars podcast with Lit Shaw. And that is actually what reminded me of that whole faders at zero and proper levels at recording and stuff and rough mix and all those things that I just explained. That reminded me of that because Vance explains it so well in this episode. And I said a thing about fader resolution. And I think I need to explain what I mean by that. The thing is, when the fader in your DAW or on a mixer, on a hardware like analog mixer, is around zero, a tiny move of that fader will give you a 0.1 or 0.2 dB change. Mm-hmm. If the mixer is at -20, that same tiny move will give you 2, 3, I don't know how many dBs change, because the resolution is not the same. So if you want to write faders and write automation or just make tiny adjustments, it's very hard to do if the fader is way down there. And if you keep it around zero, you can make very detailed tweaks to the whole mix. Mm-hmm. So even when people use these preamps that you need to crank, and even if they need to record with higher levels, or back in the day when they recorded to tape and they had to record loud to get a proper signal to noise ratio, when it comes back to the mixing desk from the tape, for example, they would use the trim knob at the beginning of, at the start of every channel, and bring it down so that the fader could stay around zero. So it's the same, even then, they try to do that exact same thing, because if you're on an SSL and you want to make a rough mix and you want to impress the clients in the room and you want to have a good starting point for your mix, you don't want the faders all the way down, because you can't make these tiny tweaks. And also, it's just a better way of working, and it looks better. And if you look at it and everything's around zero, that just feels better than having to pull down everything so much so you don't clip the master or the mix bus. So people have always done it that way. And it's a good practice to do it in the DAW as well. You don't have to religiously stick to 0.0, but around zero. And I really think that this is a good habit. And Vance explains it so well on this podcast as well. He says the exact same thing that you said, Malcolm, that if you send that to a mixer, they're going to be very impressed. That's the first thing. But also, they can start working on your song intuitively right away. They don't have to spend the time coming up, figuring out the song and making that rough mix, which takes away from their objectivity. They can hit play and the song is there, which is super awesome. And it's also a good, as I said, a good reference point to come back to. You just have to, if you mess up, just put the faders to zero, there's your rough mix. And if you archive sessions that way, if you send it to people that way, that's just a good habit. And I think there's a lot. It's a good practice also. And if, like you said, those 10 minutes of just quick rebalancing, also I think um, helps you learn to make these intuitive, quick decisions and trust your gut, because you will find that these are often the best decisions. Oftentimes, these quick rough mixes are the best decisions you make. And after hours of tweaking, if you compare it to the initial rough or to that quick balance that you made, you may not have improved the balance. Maybe the initial thing, the initial reaction was actually the best thing.
Totally. I've actually seen some mixing competitions where some of the higher placing mixes were done entirely with volume and pan. No EQ or compression or anything. Just those two things. So consider that, like, they're competing against people that are doing X, Y, and Z. And then these people just used X and Y.
Yeah.
And had fantastic results. Of course, that is very dependent on an excellently engineered album, I think. But that actually brings up like a great train of thought of that, like, all of these plugins are to kind of make up for engineering flaws, where volume and pan is all, if the album's already engineered perfectly, it's all you need. It's done.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. And by the way, if you're using plugins that require a harder level, like say you recorded something very quietly, like I said, like I suggested, and then you want to insert a plugin that requires a higher level just to work properly, you can always insert a gain plugin before that plugin, turn it up, and then turn it down again after the plugin. Like, there's ways to go to work around that. And even if that requires an extra step, it's usually, most of the time, if you do that, you are going to be around a level that already works better with most plugins, because like all the analog and simulations and stuff, like the emulations, they tend to have limited headroom. They distort more if you hit them harder. So most of the time you will be closer to the sweet spot if you stick to that rule and keep the input a little lower. And if you're really too quiet, you can always just bring it up. But yeah, you're totally right, Malcolm. In an ideal situation, it was so well engineered, and that you don't have to do a lot to it. And if you're given a balance that already works, you're less tempted to do a lot, I think. If I get a session that's all where the levels are all over the place and I have to learn and figure out the song, and it's like nothing really fits together well, there's the temptation to just dive into individual things right away and just start fixing things. And when I open a session and I can just hit play and hear the song, I might be more careful in the beginning. Like, it's just I don't know. I just perceive it differently, and I believe if you do it from the beginning with that in mind, and you're constantly making a rough mix and you're constantly balancing things out well, I believe that your production will be better, because you are constantly hearing things in context and you are not getting lost in the details so much. So, but yeah, I think we've covered that.
Yeah. I will just, the last thing to add to that
Yeah.
is that when I hear something that is like just really bad, it is when this hasn't been done at all, and everything's just like hitting, the whole mix is just smashing red on your master fader, because it's all too loud, and that's when crazy decisions are happening. I'm like, this is like the loosest performance I've ever heard of this person, and it's because they can't hear anything, right? I mean, actually, that's actually somehow a point we haven't mentioned. How are people meant to play to this song and perform their parts well if they can't hear what's going on? That is probably the biggest reason to have a good reference mix while you're tracking, is that people have to actually play music to it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely, totally. And and maybe that also leads to, like, think about it. If you record with very hot levels and you do overdubs and you add things on top of what's already there, you constantly have to turn down everything every time you add something new, because you're already maybe you're already distorting on the mix bus. It's already hard to hear things because it's like, in the red, distorting, as you said. And then you add something on top and you want to hear that, so you have to turn it up even louder. And then either it like distorts even more, or you have to bring down all the rest of the tracks. And you have to do that every single time you add something. So if you start quiet enough in the beginning, you can just add things and you don't have to touch anything. So, and I think that sometimes when that happens is when people they just want to capture an idea that they had real quick, and they don't want to change the whole mix, or don't want to bring down all the faders. So they just throw it on top, turn it up, and it distorts, but they want to move on, and then they don't hear it properly. And I think that's where those things happen.
Definitely. Yeah. I agree.
So I have two actionable things written down here that I want to talk about, if you don't mind. And that is And I want to hear your opinion on that as well, Malcolm. The first thing is one tool that helped me learn to balance things out properly, especially in the mix, was, and I don't use it these days anymore, but I'm thinking of getting one again. And that was a controller, like a hardware control surface for the DAW. I'm sort of in between. Like I had some and then I sold them. And like I work with a mouse very well, I think. But there is one thing that I can't do as well with a mouse. And that is when I have to balance out two things against each other. Like for example, the best example would be two mics on a guitar amp, on a guitar cab.
Right.
So there is, if you do it with a mouse, and you've done the whole faders at zero, clip gain and whatnot, but you still need to fine tune the balance, and you're starting the mix, for example, or you're dialing the final guitar tone. So if you do it with a mouse, you have to grab one fader, set a level, and then you have to grab the other fader and set a level in relation to the first one. If you have a controller with more than one fader, you can touch both of those faders and put them in relation. You can just dial in the balance, and you can even close your eyes and do it until it feels right. But you can do it simultaneously, and there's something to doing that works better for me than grabbing one fader at a time. And that is literally the only reason why I would ever use control surfaces, because I don't need them for automation. I don't need them for everything else. I just need them for that thing alone. That is the only advantage to me that actual faders have, is that I can grab two of them and put them in context. And I only need two. I don't need more than two, but just two. So.
Yeah. I don't have a control surface at my studio, and I do get on fine, but I agree that faders are awesome for that reason. There is a studio I work at pretty often that has like 12 channels, I think, of digital faders that they're synced to Pro Tools, great, and works awesome. And I do love tracking through that. It's really quick just to like find that initial balance. It's, okay, new instrument coming in on the first pass, I've got it dialed in, no problem, kind of thing. It's a very intuitive way. I don't know if it's like imperative though. You can definitely get by without it. Now that is said by two guys that you're listening to on this podcast who are really good at their DAWs. Like, we're really quick at getting to the screen we need and finding our track that we need to adjust. So, like, arguably do it as quick as somebody with faders. Yeah. If you're not proficient with your DAW yet, faders might be a good option.
Yeah, I agree. And the weird thing is, I don't know why there are like one fader controllers and then there are like 8 or 12 fader controllers, because I don't need
two.
any. Two. Yeah, give me two. Exactly. I don't want to ride 10 faders at a time. Like I can do that. My brain can't do that. I can't focus on. I tried it. I had an SSL with 16 channels, and I thought, wow, that's so cool. I can use all my fingers and like do the automation. And what really happened is I only ever used one to write an automation. Like I would write the drums or the snare or the bass or whatever, and then I would write the next thing because I just can't focus on more than that. But I used two sometimes to create a balance between different microphones, for example. But so I don't know why there is 1 or 8 and not just 2 to balance things out. I don't know, but that might just be me. But I really think that is one thing where a controller is helpful. And as you said, Malcolm, if you are not already fast with your DAW, it might also make you a little more efficient or intuitive or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's that. Okay, cool. And then the other thing I wanted to tell you is a trick that I heard from Shakir King, who is a great engineer, mixer, producer. You probably know his work. And I heard him talk about something that I found interesting and helpful. And it's not always perfect, but it's a great starting point. And he was talking about a technique he uses to balance out the low end, the relation between bass and kick drum specifically. And what he did was, what he explained, and I tried it, and it really worked for me as a starting point at least. What he explained was, he pulls up a VU meter on his master, and then he solos the kick drum, and he makes sure that the VU meter is like the kick drum is hitting around -3 or something like around that. Or he just looks at whatever it's hitting at and takes that as a reference. But he says to make it easy, he said around -3. And then he would add the bass channel to the kick drum and would find a level for that. And then he would make sure that, or he would aim for the two together to be around 0 then. So if the bass and the kick drum, if the bass adds an additional 3 dB to the overall mix when you add it to the kick drum, he finds that the balance in the low end or between those two things is usually close. And I
Right.
thought it's interesting, and I tried it, and it's right. I like it's not perfect, but it's a great starting point because that just means that the way of U meter works and reacts and all that, and how levels add up and stuff. What that just means is that you have a pretty similar volume or amount of energy between those two things. So
Right.
none will be like the kick drum not the kick drum and nor the bass will be much louder than the other thing. They will just be balanced well. Now, it might be that in your song you need a louder kick drum or a louder bass. That's of course. But as a starting point to make sure they have a similar amount of energy, that is really a cool trick to try. And I've tried it a
Right.
couple of times and it works really, really well. And you don't have to start at -3. Like if you already have your rough mix and you solo the kick and you are at -6 or whatever, then at the bass and see if it's around -3. And if it's
Yeah.
a lot louder than that, that might mean that the bass is louder or has more energy than the kick drum, or vice versa. So I just
Yeah.
found it interesting. Have you ever tried something like that?
I have actually, and based on Jakir King as well. I love him.
Yeah.
Jakir, if you're listening, come on the podcast, please.
That would be super dope.
It would be so cool. He's one of my favorite ever. But I might have heard a different episode or podcast or whatever I picked it up on, where he talked about it. And for that reason, but also for the reason of him always working in different rooms, it was like, if I do this and this, I know what it normally sounds like. And low end is notoriously kind of the hardest thing to figure out in a new space. So he would do this in a new studio and be like, oh, that's what this equal kick relationship sounds like here. Okay, I have to kind of adjust for that and get used to that. And like, no, that's my new baseline. And I thought that was really brilliant. And so I've started kind of doing stuff like that where it's like, I've got some songs I know and I pull them up in a new studio and I'm like, okay, there's some differences here. I have to remember this. He's a genius. He's so good.
Yeah, totally. And that's interesting what you just said, because that means you can actually use that to just make sure you do the same thing again, or you are in the ballpark. So that means maybe in your genre or on a record you're working, like from song to song, you don't want that equal kick bass balance, but you have a reference that works really well and that you like, and you want to just recreate a similar balance. Then you have to open up that session, look at what happens, like if you combine the kick and the snare and you do the kick and the bass and you do that, or any two elements, and then in a new session you can find a similar balance easily by just hitting for the same numbers. So that is not only a general thing you can do to get an even balance between two things, but it's just a way to recreate something you did before in a new room or in a new session or whatever. So that's actually a really good idea.
Yeah, and just such a good hack for anybody that's listening that doesn't have a great room or good monitoring. You know, it's really hard to hear subs sometimes, and like I often get stuff from people where it's just so loud and they have no idea because they just can't hear it. It's just not audible for them. And this is like, if you actually do that, it's probably going to be under control. It's pretty cool.
And the reason, by the way, why you want to use a VU meter is because these are slower than the peak meters on your channels in the DAW. They show you sort of an average, and it's easier to see, like visually, the energy, but you don't see the peaks really. And it's super hard to do with a very fast peak meter. It's easier to do with a VU meter because you want that average, but you still want it to be quick enough to like see it react to the kick drum. And the VU meter does that, and it's like I don't know. I think it would probably work with a peak meter, but it's way easier with a VU. And the VU is like the thing with the thing you see on old gear, and like I don't know how to describe it. I put a picture in the show notes and also a link, because there is a great one. If you don't have one, there's a great one by Klanghelm, is the company called. They make great stuff in general. And they have one that's called the VU-MT. I use that all the time. It has a deluxe version as well with a little EQ and filters and MS stuff built into it. But it's super cheap. I think the basic thing is free, the standard VU meter. And I use that all the time. And you can calibrate it. You can set how fast it reacts and all cool things. So I'll put a link in the show notes to that, because I think a VU meter is a great balancing tool, a great thing to have for many reasons. It's also good to, like, if you calibrate it to -18, for example, you know that around 0 on the VU meter is the right level where to hit like analog stuff or emulations
Right.
of analog stuff. So that's a whole different conversation. But like having a VU meter and learning how that works helps you get levels right. Let's say it like that.
Cool. Yeah, that's a great tip.
All right. I think
Yeah.
that's pretty much it.
Yeah. I mean, and honestly, we keep going on to different parts of the songs, our workflow for how we go through it and stuff like that. But I think this is a good to get all our listeners' heads thinking about this and figuring out ways they could try and implement it. That's probably a great start.
Yeah. Okay, but that brings me to like one thing I need to answer.
All right.
Like, I need to ask you that because you've just touched on it, and I think it's important. Different parts of the song, and I think we need to talk about that real quick.
All right, I'm in.
Yeah, because what we've been talking about this whole episode was a static mix, a static first rough mix, or at least that's what it sounded like when we were talking about it.
Yeah.
But this first pass, this first rough mix that we create quickly doesn't have to be completely static. And there is ways to do that. Like I said, like with the clip gain, if I think that the verse is perfect, but in the chorus, the balance doesn't work anymore, I just split the event, like the clip, and I bring up or down the stuff that I don't like in the chorus. So that's the first fastest way for me to do that, to react to how the song develops. But you can also, of course, write a pass of automation while you do the rough mix before you actually start mixing or using plugins. So sometimes it's a good idea to automate a gain plugin or a trim knob if you have that in your DAW, and write volume automation and create the balance that way, so that it works throughout the whole song. And then whatever plugins and stuff you're using, it will just like, yeah, you can do that afterwards. But it's sort of backwards to what many people do, because I know that many people will start tweaking things with plugins, do it on a static mix, and then in the end they'll write faders. And maybe, and I believe that this is the case, maybe you should make sure that the rough mix really works, and not only for one part but for the whole song. And that probably requires you to write some automation or use clip gain before you even start using plugins and do the rest of the mix. Now,
Yeah.
I don't do it in like this extreme detail every single time, but I want to make sure that I can listen through the whole song without things falling apart completely in one part.
Yep, I'd agree. Another little hack to that is if something's so different, I'll just like duplicate the track and then mute the part that works or doesn't work on, and then leave it open on the other track and just like totally change it there or whatever. There's kind of lots of little clever ways to get around it. One tip I'll give in relation to this is start at the loudest point of the song. So for your first static mix, find the loudest section. Maybe that's like the last chorus, the outro, solo, probably something with vocals actually. But find that. It's usually pretty easy to spot because the waveform's bigger on everything. and then get your volume, your rough static mix balanced there first, and then start going backwards to the quiet stuff. Because if you get it set for the quiet stuff and then hit the loud stuff, it might just blow out and everything. There's not enough headroom left over. So you want to kind of work backwards, and that's really going to save you a lot of time.
Awesome. Great tip here. Yeah, totally. Cool. A lot of actionable stuff in here as well. Like great tips all around. I want to tell you about something before we wrap it up, and that is on this same topic that we've been talking about. I've written 2 blog posts. One is called Keep the Faders at Zero, and the other is called The Most Important Mixing Skill, I think is the title. You'll find both of those if you go to the selfrecordingband.com/blog. And the thing is, you might not be aware, but since the end of April, I developed this writing habit or practice for myself mainly. And I've been writing blog posts every single day, Monday to Friday. And I've written over 50 blog posts at this point since that. And like more than that, 60 maybe. I don't know. Like every single day since, like, with the exception of 1 week vacation, every single day since then. And it's pretty cool. Like, I'm pretty proud of that little library that I created there. Yeah. And I would love for you to check it out. So if you go to the selfrecordingband.com/blog, you'll see those posts. They are very easy to consume, pretty short, to the point, on specific topics that just come to mind every day. I reflect on my previous workday or whatever, and then I cover a topic that's just top of mind, or a question that I get or whatever. Like, it's just a library of thoughts and things I want to talk about. So there's that, and I think it's really valuable, and I want to know if it's really valuable for you. So if you checked it out, let me know what you think. Let me know if that is cool stuff in there, if that's helpful, if I should continue doing that. I mean, it's good practice for me, and I think I will continue. But if nobody's reading it, who knows how long I'm going to do it? So I really want you to check it out. So theselfrecordingband.com/blog. Let me know what you think. All right.
Well, we'll see you next week then.
I think so. Bye. Thank you for listening.
I think so. It'd be odd if we stopped now.
We're so bad at ending episodes.
Yeah,
Bye. Thank you for listening.
Bye.